welcome to another episode of All Water Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me as ever is Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshall. Now today we're going to be looking at Poppywatch, which can be found on Twitter at Giantpoppywatch. Now, whilst I have aspirations to regularly hang out on Twitter, joining in conversations with my shining wit, I fail miserably and rarely spend much time there. So, Chris, when I do wander by Twitter, you're usually there hanging out, shining with your wit. Poppywatch, tell us what Poppywatch is.
So Poppywatch is a kind of a collective album, I think is probably the best way of phrasing it, of interesting approaches people have to wearing poppies and Remembrance Day activities, or Remembrance Month activities, or Remembrance Season activities, or Remembrance biannual Remembrance Fest activities, depending on how you look at it. Their Twitter bio says watching poppies, rating poppies, guardian of remembrance, and in speech marks, self-appointed poppy enforcer. And that's a quote from Roger Helmer, who was once upon a time an MEP. So yeah, basically I think people send them images of extreme poppy wearing activities and they repurpose them for Twitter content, often with comedic effect.
And he pins at the top his Cookie Monster wearing a poppy on TV with Chris Tarrant, which I wonder if said more about social conventions of somebody sitting in the studio going, does Cookie Monster need to wear a poppy? Where do we stand on puppets and poppies? Will we get lambasted for not wearing a poppy?
Yeah, genuinely, I don't know how we all collectively as historians didn't just call the First World War centenary off when this happened, because clearly we're doing nothing. Because you're right, a group of people must have sat around behind the scenes and gone, will it look bad? Will we get complaints if the Cookie Monster isn't wearing a poppy? Will it look like he's insulting our war dead?
And an American Muppet at that.
And an American Muppet. Surely the answer to this is, if anybody complains, the answer is, it's a Muppet. It's an American Muppet. It's not real. But no one said that, because for whatever reason, the crushing pressure or the social conventions made them think it's better to do this and look stupid than to not do it and be lambasted.
Or to be devil's advocate, perhaps they did it because they thought they realised it was funny, but they could hide behind they felt that they had to put it on for the social convention.
I much prefer that as a reason. Because if they've done it as satire, it is funny. If they've done it earnestly, it's upsetting.
and I think that's the point about Giantpoppywatch. It is satire. And like all satire, it's quite painful at times. It's heading for the Jonathan Swift levels of satirical commentary on the state of the nation. Places we are eating our children
and then putting poppies on their plates.
Well, it's funny because what they do highlight is somehow it is also how the poppy has become, I'm not sure if politicised is the word, jingoistic. It's interesting that he highlights the chap in his Union Jack suit with his Union Jack face mask, and then points out he could only be more British if he wore a poppy.
There is, when you kind of scroll through some of the examples, there is a very weird class thing going on in a lot of the examples. A lot of them seem very, very kind of targeted at what might be termed working class expressions of remembrance. So there's a lot about tattoos in there. There's a lot of kind of white vans with decals and that on them. There is a slightly uncomfortable classist element going on that, it's possible that the working classes are the ones who are doing this wrong. Which is a little weird.
I think the funny ones are the ones where it's clearly the media that, like the Cookie Monster one, where it's a bad decision was made by a W1A committee, rather than a bad decision was made by an individual. Those are less amusing. I think you're right.
You mean like the Channel X laying a wreath with a lady, buxom lady there, who oddly doesn't wear a poppy, but she's laying the wreath.
It's the hashtags for that make me laugh a lot. Are we allowed to read those out?
I'd looked at that about 3 times until I got that it was Television X. I couldn't work out what the hell was going on. That was really peculiar.
I mean, there is also along with the class element, there is a sexist element to it. And I'm looking at one making fun less of the rampant TV which has posted the image than of the woman whose image has been posted, which is unfortunate. But they're particularly where they're commenting on images of the body, it's very often female bodies that are being censored.
Which is interesting in itself, the idea that there's a right way and a wrong way of doing remembrance, which is something that the account is ostensibly kind of trying to push back against. The fact that you have to wear a poppy, that's the right way, and that means that the Cookie Monster is going to have to wear one as well, because we all do. And that by going that far, you are now doing remembrance wrong. But at the same time, the very idea that you have to wear a poppy is that there's a right way to do remembrance and there's a wrong way to do remembrance. So it's interesting that they become kind of weirdly self-perpetuating on both sides of the street.
You can trace that back to 1918. And I mean, the classic example, of course, is the Victory Ball scandal, when in 1919, there's a whole lot of Victory Balls in 1919. It's the Daily Mail, isn't it? I don't have my copy of Great War Myth and Memory on me. Yeah. Because he tells the story, the Daily Mail comes out and against the Victory Balls and says, this is not how to remember our glorious dead, to a whole lot of people who served alongside our glorious dead. And again, the class elements, the gender elements, that women are allowed to remember only in particular ways. And that of course gets codified, that becomes something statutory, that a woman loses her widow's pension if she remarries. She either remains, this is Janice Lomas's point, she either remains in perpetual memorial to her husband, or she loses her pension and the recognition of her loss. Class, gender, these are all the things that have been involved in right from the moment that the poppy emerges as a symbol of remembrance, or that Britain starts to have a specific commemorative practice around the First World War. So it's fascinating that even in the age of social media, exactly the same themes are recurring in different ways.
What Dan Toppin says about those kind of victory balls, because the Daily Mail ends up they win that argument by basically putting pressure on the venues like the Royal Albert Hall and the other venues to stop taking the bookings, and they kind of run them out of town. But it's that moment when the living gets sidelined in favour of they lose a stake in remembrance festivals, and it gets the remembrance and obviously saying that our moment for the dead, not for the living. It's interesting then how that is kind of like the starting point of what was a big thing for a lot of us in the centenary, in that traditionally remembrance of the wars is about remembrance of the dead. It's not a remembrance of the survivors, despite the fact that the survivors quite significantly outnumber the dead.
Yeah, and the fact that what are we getting on for 5 years after the centenary already? How did that happen? And I'm still trying to write my book on the survivors. It's not easy. I wonder if that sort of brings us on to the Captain Tom memorials on this, and the silhouette. So one of the recurring images alongside the poppy on the Poppywatch Twitter feed is the silhouette of the First World War soldier. Oh, where is that? Does that originate? I've seen it on so many book covers now that I no longer know.
I reckon it's taken from the Battle of the Somme film. The ending of it, you get a lot of soldiers silhouetted on the horizon, and I think it's taken from or inspired by that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anyway, so that silhouette of the soldier in the Brodie helmet bowing over his rifle next to a cross appears again and again in these memorials, on lawns, in graffiti, or murals, I should say, all sorts of places. And then suddenly, as of about last year, you suddenly start to get silhouettes of Captain Tom and his walker, but after his death.
Would have been creepy if it was before.
Yes, it would be, but it's the point that he becomes part of this memorial. It's that point about we remember the dead, not the living.
And he becomes an unknown soldier, but a very recognisably known soldier.
But it's that oddity about the longevity, because of course he was a veteran, but he was a veteran who survived the war for a very long time, like Harry Patch. But suddenly they only become truly part of the commemorative process on their death. And there's that Andrew Motion poem for about Harry Patch. I think it was written actually before he dies, but then he writes another one to commemorate Harry Patch's death. He was the poet laureate at the time. He's supposed to be commemorating royal events, and what he does is he commemorates the death of Harry Patch. And there is this moment at which even those who survive only become part of the memorial process for the war in which or for part of national memory once they're dead. They can't be part of national memory as a living being.
Well, and what becomes interesting about Harry Patch is, when Harry Patch was alive, he was very clear when, towards the end of his life, exactly what he thought about war. But once dies and moves into kind of symbolic moment, just strip all of that away. It becomes a blank canvas to project recognizable structures of memorial onto. Even
though Harry Patch sort of even acknowledged he didn't really play much of a part in the war because he was so young at the time. You're lauded for, which is something my mother continually complains about. People become heroes for living a long time, having served in the war, rather than actually what they did. And her point being that the heroes are all dead because they tended to be the ones that either died in the war or were in it much earlier on, rather than the ones who were turned up right at the end.
I mean, there is an element of sort of unsung heroism, and you see it in the Bletchley Park Memorial, the commemoration of the people, what does it Churchill called them, the goose that laid the golden egg but never cackled. That there are some elements of commemoration which only happen later because we start to recognize how important logistics are or military intelligence is to actually making the people who rush into battle able to rush into battle fully armed, or whatever it is. But the way in which commemorative practice works, because of that emphasis on death, the longevity survival becomes a really odd part of how we remember in this country.
I wonder if some of what Poppywatch is picking up on is sort of facilitated by the commercialisation of the poppy. It was quite a simple. When I was growing up, it was a paper poppy. Now you get enamel poppies, there's jewellery poppies. You can endlessly equip yourself with poppy ephemera to plaster yourself with, and that's some poppies on cars. The car pop, and that's almost what you're seeing here, taken to the nth degree.
Well, I'm looking at on their Twitter account at the moment a tweet from 10th of November last year, showing the Royal British Legion pull the pin bottle of rum. Which has got a lid and a ring pull on it like a hand grenade. That's a choice you've made to include that as a thing.
I got asked to advise on a marketing campaign for beer, Trench beer, I think it was. I said beer wasn't my thing and passed on that. That was during the centenary. But of course, the original poppies were made of silk. So the paper poppy is a mid-century innovation, which makes them disposable. And that's quite interesting. The silk poppies were supposed to last, and and I'm never quite sure, because they're a fundraising item. Fundraising in two ways. The purchase of them, which grows out of the flag days, which had existed before then. And there was a lot of pressure. There's Peter Grant's written some interesting stuff about fundraising in the war, philanthropy in the war, and about the social pressure to buy flags on flag days, which dates back to the South African War. Show your patriotism by buying flags. So there is already that social pressure there. So there's the social pressure to buy the poppy. So there's the fundraising in the purchase of the poppies, rather. But then there's also the support of the Royal British Legion, because it is the disabled men who make the poppies in the Earl Haig factories, and Earl and Lady Haig factories. So it's providing work. It feeds into this narrative of disabled ex-servicemen re-entering employment and reintegration of the returning servicemen into the economic life of the country, and self-sufficiency and all the stuff that I write endlessly about when I'm writing about disabled ex-servicemen. So in buying the poppy, you are supporting that economy as well. You are supporting the employment of these men, not just giving them money. And I think that's actually quite a fundamental difference in the way the British Legion positions the action of buying poppy memorabilia. But in that sense, a little jeweled poppy or little diamante poppy is not very different from a silk poppy, right? It's meant to be perpetual, but it's also something you're meant to buy every year. It's an interesting paradox there.
When you offer a range of goods away from your core product, though, you then have to merchandise and market them, which then moves you into a different sphere altogether. And I can't remember if it was Dan Todman or Jay Winters points out there that at some point popular beat combos such as the Spice Girls and Westlife are used to make the campaign more relevant, which clearly it sort of dates the book. But when you start to merchandise it, again, it's shifting away from what you're doing, at which point the British Legion gets stuck between, well, we have to make money, but at the same time, how does that work with Remembrance? Because, what would Poppywatch make of the Spice Girls prancing around plastered in poppies?
Probably a lot of Twitter content.
It's quite hard to square the circle how that works. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, suppose a partial comparison is probably the bluet in France, the cornflower, which I'm pretty sure has much tighter controls of when it's sold. I mean, you can buy them online more across the years, but I'm pretty sure in the street you can only buy them like maybe a couple of days before the 11th of November or just on the day itself. And I think maybe again in May, but it's a much there's less of what you'd recognize as a season for it. Well, there's a weird offshoot of that, because if you consider kind of like the charity aspect of it, what you get a lot now is every year around about Remembrance Sunday, football teams, particularly Premier League teams, will wear shirts which have a poppy on them, and then they'll get auctioned for charity afterwards. But you've reached a point now where that is almost universal. But go back 10 or so years, and it really wasn't the case. Some clubs would choose not to do it, and some players would choose not to do it. There's a player from Northern Ireland called James McLean who always gets in kind of issues every year for refusing to wear a poppy, because I think he grew up in and around the area that Bloody Sunday happened and may have had family members involved in it, and is not keen on wearing a symbol of the British military. But go back before pre-Brexit, so even like maybe 2008ish, something like that, it suddenly becomes a massive deal in the press that the England national team aren't allowed to wear a poppy on their shirt when they play international games around the 11th of November. And UEFA and FIFA are criticising our war dead, and they're being unfair and they're being mean because we're not allowed to wear these poppies. But England have played international football matches on the 11th of November, literally on the 11th of November and around the 11th of November for decades beforehand, and it had never been a big deal. Nobody had ever thought, oh, we should absolutely put poppies on the shirts. And then suddenly, around 2006, 2008 time, it becomes a massive, big PR thing that we should be allowed to do these. It's not a political symbol because there's nothing political about war and war remembrance. And suddenly it becomes a culture war.
But that's partly a shift because we've been involved in those Iraq and Afghan wars. So we have casualties coming home. So it makes it more pertinent. Though the iconography that we stick with, the symbolism, the iconography is very generic World War I, World War II with the Brodie helmet and the Lee Enfield rifle. So you feel kind of comfortable with that symbolism. I'm
interested in that slightly throwaway comment you made there about it as a symbol of the British military. First of all, it's the poppy's not just a symbol in Britain. It's used by Canada as the post of a pickup truck covered in poppies in Canada on Poppywatch, and the Australians use it as well. So it's also, I'm back to this point about it being originally an ex-service from a war of mass mobilization. And the fact that it's come to stand for as a symbol of the British military, actually, that's where I, as a historian, started going, oh God, it's lost its meaning. Because of the extent to which the men who it was originally to commemorate and to support was in part because they weren't the military. They were the nation. There was no imperative to commemorate the regular army in the 19th century in this way. It is when you have a war of mass mobilization of men leaving homes and futures to die or be injured that you suddenly need a national commemoration of that sacrifice that the poppy comes to represent. So yeah, I get really antsy about it's a symbol of the military interpretation, which I think I think today it is, and that's a problem.
That's why the symbolism of the Brodie helmet and the rifle it fits for the two wars, and doesn't get updated because they are conscript armies. They're large civilian armies.
And it's, every year Strictly Come Dancing does its Remembrance Day Saturday, the Saturday before Remembrance Sunday. And I know I've spoken about this last year or the year before. The group dance is usually something to do with the Second World War. The mobilization of a particular moment in history is really interesting.
Presumably because their music's more jive than Keep the Home Fires Burning might not be quite as arresting as, and it's a long way to Tipperary.
Well, I think you could do a decent foxtrot to keep the home fires burning, but
and the Charleston's probably too late.
It's always some story about a man going away and coming back, and to be fair, they are raising funds for the RBL as part of that, and they always they go around and visit poppy sellers. Now, there's an interesting shift related to the commercialization. Of course, a lot of this stuff has moved online, but do either of you remember when I was doing? So I remember this when I was doing my PhD. So we're getting on for 20 years ago now, but every year there seemed to be a panic in the press about the declining number of people willing to sell poppies, which has just disappeared now. And I think because nobody goes out on this, that this was pre-pandemic, it had disappeared. This was during the centenary that they went, that people don't actually go out and sell. There aren't volunteer salespeople anymore. You see them at tills. They go into schools. My children's school every single year, or the primary school certainly, have opportunities for the children to buy poppies and slap bands. But I suspect a lot of it's moved online, that you order your poppy online these days.
I have to admit there is a large online poppy section, but I have to admit when I lived in London, they never had any problem finding poppy sellers because the military was just mobilised and it was the military stood at every tube station. And where I am in North Yorkshire is not a problem living close to the largest military base in Europe because that too just is the military sell poppies on market day and so again, you've got that connection straight away with the military.
But that's a shift because it never originally it was women, and this was part of women's voluntary service, and it originated. I'm forgetting the name of the American woman who actually came up with the idea of selling poppies as a type of Flag Day, and then sort of gave it to the British Legion as a fundraising, and using McCrae's poem as inspiration. She'd read it in I think the New York when it was published in the New York Times. But interwar period into the mid-century, this is what middle class women did as part of like the flowers in church. It was part of that female philanthropy of the 20th century, was selling poppies in November.
I don't know if you remember at the back end of that kind of, there's a decline in volunteers. It took a weird kind of cultural shift in that it's not a decline of volunteers. Poppy selling is being suppressed. And it's an outrage that it is. And that became a slightly cultural war thing because the implication was always that we know who's doing this because they feel, it's an Iraq war. It's like, basically the tabloids used to imply that Muslims were stopping people selling poppies because it was offensive, when what you often got out of councils was we're only allowed to have one designated charity seller on a street on any given day of the week. And why should it be the poppy over the British Heart Foundation? And it used to then become actually a clash between charities for real estate.
But before that, there was another narrative of women aren't doing this anymore, and it was part of that. Why are all these women going out and having jobs and not doing all the volunteer work, not doing the caring work? Because this was part and parcel of women's unpaid care, and there was certainly in parts of particularly the conservative press that every year would have an anxiety attack about why women were in paid labor rather than out collecting money for the wounded or disabled ex-servicemen.
It could also have their husbands might have retired and then said, well, I'll sell poppies, I was in the war, and then took over the role in some strange domineering way that when men retire they suddenly feel the need to do the housework badly to make themselves useful.
I'm not sure that ever became a public narrative in the press, I have to say, but I'd love it if that were true. That would redeem the loss of the female poppy seller as a cultural figure.
Is it problematic for the army to sell poppies? Because in many respects, the poppy is somehow connected with that Blackadder idea of futility in the First World War. It's notable that they removed the Hague Fund off is it Hague Fund was written on the centre of the poppy, which might again in the 90s try to shift it away from the idea of dead. So if the military sell it, are they promoting a glorious dead, or are they promoting the futility of war?
There's a very famous, slightly controversial image of a tornado bomber covered in poppies that the Royal Air Force did a while ago, which is like, not sure about that.
Or the various flybys where they drop poppies. Didn't they drop them over the Tower of London at one point?
Yes, they did.
But if you think about it, the poppy itself is an implicit criticism. It's really interesting that it's very often the government that's saying that gets angsty about wearing poppies in Parliament, now that it's televised. There's an implicit criticism of the government in the poppy, of course, because it's saying you're not providing sufficient support. We need to ask the general public.
Otherwise, this wouldn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. And never have. Pensions have, even at their most generous before 1921, and the government had to be forced to provide pensions from 1917 as a way of bribing men to actually go to war in the first place. It was part of the recruitment effort before conscription was brought in, because the third sector is always an implicit criticism of lack of government support, and yet that is entirely missing from contemporary interpreters. I'm not sure it was ever there in the interwar period, but in reality, having to have this massive campaign of charitable fundraising to support your war wounded should be considered an implicit criticism of the government for failing to do what it should be doing in terms of supporting the war wounded.
Which is actually something Poppywatch makes a point of with the Captain Tom commentary. Where does knitting and poppies fit in then on Poppywatch?
I find that so where is it? It's a post from the 11th of November last year, which is 4 pictures, 3 of yarn bombing, people who've knitted poppies and stuck them on post boxes, or there appears to be an entire knitted soldier. But then the first one is an image of a sheep with a poppy stenciled on it. And it says, in case you were wondering where the special war wool comes from to knit these things, which that just made me laugh.
I mean, the captions they do for these are funny. But yeah, there's one further down on 9th of November 2021 last year, which is someone has put a knitted Trident submarine on top of a postbox in Scotland, with some poppies around it. Which
it could of course be a U-boat.
It could be a U-boat.
Which I'm not sure what that would say either, which is another slightly odd one. But
I'm a knitter, and I have to say that I'm not sure knitting is necessarily the most sensible medium for some of these. But I mean, the interesting thing about the yarn bombing, the postbox toppers, is the bit that Poppywatch doesn't give the context of is that these are year-round things that people knit. There's huge amounts of knitted postbox toppers for the Jubilee, which didn't have any poppies on them. They were all crowns and corgis, and this has been going on for a while. And knitted poppies, actually, poppies look quite good knitted, and you could crochet a little poppy quite easily as a badge. It functions in the same way the diamante or the silk poppy does. Not sure about the knitted trident, however.
Because when I was looking at the wrong Poppywatch, I was just looking at Poppywatch, not Giantpoppywatch. They make a point of claiming who is wearing a self-important big poppy, which is interesting because the knitted poppies always end up larger than the regular poppies. And you do kind of get this poppy off where people seem to have bigger poppies than other people.
But the silk poppies were always quite big.
I'm pretty sure that in previous years, it will be interesting to see if he does it this year. Marc Francois generally likes to announce he's the first MP wearing a poppy in the House of Commons each year as a status thing, maybe, question mark. So it'll be interesting to see if he does it again this year, if it's like a recurring thing.
Well, we should say at this point we should note that we are recording this in mid to late October.
Yeah, we could have 4 or 5 governments by the time this gets out.
Indeed. Will Mark Francois still be in the House of Commons?
Or a general election?
Yeah, Prime Minister resignation day seems to roll around quicker every month.
But if the one immediately below the Trident one is interesting, at least, again, this is me as a New Yorker, which is the house wrapped with a poppy, a bit like a gift wrapping, which the only thing it reminds me is every year Tiffany on Fifth Avenue wraps their store for Christmas with a big red bow. So that's exactly what it looks like.
I'm sure I've seen that in like American Christmas films.
Oh, it's iconic. It's been going on for decades, the Tiffany store, along with Lord and Taylor windows. It's sort of, Christmas has come when. And that happens earlier every year.
It's funny because some of these acts of remembrance almost sort of roll into, especially when it refers to houses, do almost roll into the spectacular of the over-decorated Christmas house, when houses are flooded with lights and poppies and cutouts of soldiers.
Yeah, or again, I imagine it's probably more an American thing. It certainly was when I was in Kansas City a good few years ago, of the extent to which parts of suburban America go all out for Halloween, with decorations and stuff in the gardens and things like that.
But it's because of the timing, and as Halloween has become more important or more acknowledged as a holiday in this country, in Britain, you've got Halloween, Guy Fawkes, which is now just a festival of noise as far as I can make out, and then the 11th of November, and then we're into sort of Christmas and Black Friday, and the only thing we miss is Thanksgiving. But it does make for this weird melange of sort of public decoration, and if you don't get involved, if you don't put a pumpkin out, are you unfriendly and antisocial? If you don't wear a poppy, are you unpatriotic? And they start to meld into one in really odd and difficult ways.
You're forcibly, to be a citizen, you have to remember the war dead whether you like it or not.
Veterans Day in America is a holiday, isn't it? It's a national holiday every year, which I always find interesting that the 11th of November, I mean, we have Remembrance Sunday, but it's not a work day anyway.
The thing about Veterans Days, there were parades, I guess, particularly, I think there are parades in sort of small town America. Sorry, that sounds hugely patronizing, but it's not meant to be. Because Veterans Day somehow, and I don't know if this is a post-Vietnam thing, that Veterans Day doesn't have sort of the national commemorative iconographic power that Remembrance Day has. Memorial Day, 4th of July, that's when you get all the military iconography, mainly because it's all cannons and drawing on the revolution. But I certainly, growing up, and things may have changed since I left. It's been over 20 years since I lived in the US full time. But certainly growing up, I don't remember Veterans Day as a national day of commemoration the way Remembrance Sunday is in this country. And even in the years when it wasn't a big thing, the way I think it's returned to being a big thing now, there was always an acknowledgement of Remembrance Sunday.
Do we have a favourite? Might not be the way of putting it. Do we have a favourite on Poppywatch?
I struggle to get past I have used the Cookie Monster in teaching for years. It's just a perfect example.
It's good. But I quite like, and it's just, this is unfortunate rather than anything else. It's the soldier on the lamppost, like a Christmas light, next to a massive poster that says bile beans ideal for tonic laxative. And it's just an unfortunate placement of the lamppost, and I guess that the soldier goes to the lamppost that just so happens to be next to this massive poster. It amused me.
I think my favourite is the war wool, the sheep that has been labelled to clearly go towards yarn bombing with poppies. But Chris, are you sure your favorite isn't Darth Vader wearing a poppy?
I do like Darth Vader wearing. A poppy. It would be nice if he was to, wear a little symbol of Alderaan, but maybe that's still too fresh.
Is there any form of military remembrance in the Star Wars canon?
Yes, of sorts. Everyone stand aside. I am hijacking this podcast. It will go on for another 45 minutes. So in the old Star Wars books and novels before Disney bought the franchise, the graveyard of Alderaan, which obviously gets destroyed by the Death Star in the first Star Wars film, becomes a site of remembrance and kind of memorial for Alderaanians who do what's called the return, who return to the graveyard and release gifts out into the rubble as a commemorative practice, which kind of slightly mirrors a little bit of what happens at Hiroshima as a kind of a memorial of sailing boats down the river. But in the recent Disney canon, there's a novel, I think it's called Leia, Princess of Alderaan, which notes that in the early years of the Empire, there are Clone Wars reenactors who wear Clone Wars uniforms and go around reenact Clone Wars battles as a form of kind of remembrance and memorial. That didn't make it in the book in the end, but I thought that was pretty super interesting.
I didn't expect you to have an answer. I thought you'd be saying no.
They have Empire Day, which is the date that the Empire was declared, and it's met with, and it's kind of celebrated with parades and kind of Russian, Soviet military parades and with a healthy dose of American flybys in them as well.
So Empire Day was one of the flag days that was celebrated throughout the 1920s.
Yes. So it all ties back into history. If only there was a way that people could go out and find some form of object that had like paper pages in it which contained all of this information about history and politics in the Star Wars universe, if only.
Just type your name into Kish Kempshall into Amazon and see what turns up.
I can't help but feel I've done it quite a few times already.
I think you're allowed to plug your book on this podcast, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, that's, to be honest, one of the many kind of benefits of being the only Chris Kempshall who has ever appeared to exist, is that it makes kind of finding my stuff super easy.
So as we're deviating, shall we move on from Poppywatch to what we're looking at next month, which will be for Christmas?
I hope we're going to see a return of friend of the podcast, Mark Connolly, to talk about his new book, Postcards from the Front Line. Yeah, we just have to get a date sorted out. Is where we are for recording. And
that's already got me slightly distracted, Googling First World War postcards just out of nosiness.
Yeah.
Rather than doing things that I should be doing and being paid to do.
First World War postcards are a very good way of getting around copyright rules, if you want to put images in your book. He says, clearly with no experience of his own, if anybody from any copyrightable material is listening, which undoubtedly they are.
But there's some lovely ones which are silk, which I think, Mark, I'll have to wait and read the book, which I'm waiting for eagerly, it must be said. Every now and again, in somewhere like the Imperial War Museum collections, or the little archive, you turn up these collections of beautifully embroidered silk postcards, which have then been preserved because they're little works of art in their own right. The crafter in me is going to be very happy talking about postcards.
Until next month, when we're talking postcards, we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we roast with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Come fast, Richard, how can we spend our living?